Of course, Jane, thank you so much for that generous introduction. For those of you that, I've met a lot of you, but for those of you that haven't met me yet, my name is Owen Duffy, and I am the director of the Yay Art Gallery, where we currently have the absolute honor of hosting Lain Singh Bangdel's first posthumous solo exhibition. He passed away in 2002 after a very long and fulfilling life, but it's his first posthumous solo exhibition. In addition to that, we also have the great honor of hosting his first solo institutional exhibition outside of Nepal. So that's something that is it's an honor that I don't take lightly. I'm happy to have participated in it, and it was a real pleasure organizing that exhibition with Bibhakar, who you'll meet shortly. And so I actually, well, of course, I want to introduce Priyankar Bahadur Chand, who is the grandson of one of the artists that we're going to be discussing, and perhaps one of Nepal's senior-most living contemporary artists. Shashi Bikram Shah, who he's 20 years younger than Lain Singh Bangdel, so it'll be really interesting sort of seeing that once Bangdel more or less arrived in Nepal for the first time. Actually, he was born in India, grew up outside of Nepal, even went to Paris before he actually made it to Kathmandu. We'll actually get to see sort of how, after Bangdel returned to Nepal, in what ways did art continue to manifest in Nepal, and really through the lens of Shashi Bikram Shah, he turned 82 yesterday, actually. Yeah. I think it was his birthday.
His birthday
yeah. So it's really wonderful that
we think he's older, so his official age is 82, but like he was probably born before 1940s. What do you think?
So I mean, just all the more amazing. So I've had this actually. It's such a pleasure getting to be here with you, Priyankar, because Priyankar sort of is actually taking quite a challenge upon yourself to help archive the legacy of his grandfather and his grandfather's exhibition career. And we'll talk a little bit about that when I have the presentation. But basically, Priyankar, I mean, you've sort of fallen into the art world in a way, and you're actually currently finishing your master's degree at Johns Hopkins.
In public health.
In public health. So, but you're sort of pursuing also a career in also medical anthropology. You do a lot of public health work in Nepal, and so it's really wonderful that we can have you here. And it's also, I think it's fantastic. The art world is one of those places that can actually be really porous to people from disciplines outside of art. So it's an absolute pleasure, and we'll get to learn more about your work specifically. But one of the things that I wanted to do today is actually make sure that we're all on some sort of equal footing. Since there will be varying degrees of knowledge here when it comes to Nepal's history, the history of art in Nepal. So I actually prepared a brief presentation that I was going to keep really concise, but looks like I'll be able to elaborate a little bit more, which scholar can't seize that opportunity. So, but here we are. These are the two gentlemen that we'll be talking about today. We have Lain Singh Bangdel, of course, on the left in 1978 in Bhaktapur Dabur Square. And then this is actually a relatively more current photo of Shashi Bikram Shah. So it's really actually, these two, I think, are, well, the history of art in Nepal since 1961, which is when Lain Singh Bangdel returned to Nepal, it's much wider. This is going to be a relatively narrow focus, but I think from that narrow focus, we'll actually be able to expand and have a greater sense of what's happened, in the past half century, 70 plus or 60 plus years since then. But these are two incredibly consequential figures that it'll be really fantastic to be able to actually dive into. And there's actually quite a significant amount of difference between the two, which is also really fascinating that we'll talk about. Lain Singh Bangdel is a committed secularist. He was born into a Hindu family, but religion is something that is largely absent from his work. But then Shashi Bikram Shah, as we'll actually get to see, is an artist who doesn't shy away from necessarily engaging in themes related to the Hindu cosmology. So we'll also kind of talk about that. But first, it's sort of this kind of thing where you can't talk about perhaps more recent history without talking about Lain Singh Bangdel. So first of all, this is an installation shot from the exhibition that's currently on view at the Yay. Which I encourage all of you to come visit. Feel free to stick around and chat with me afterwards. I'm more than happy to give you a tour if you're able to make the trip out next week. But we actually curated an exhibition that's about 20 works that really focuses on the arc of Lain Singh Bangdel's life in order to tell a specific and fairly concise history of how he developed an abstraction that would come to define a modern Nepal in the 1960s. So really this exhibition, it actually starts by considering Lain Singh Bangdel's life as he was growing up. He actually was born in India, not even in Darjeeling, but in a village outside Darjeeling on a tea plantation. He actually had dirt floors until he was 15. He didn't own a pair of shoes until he was 10. So he comes from very modest beginnings. And from those beginnings, he actually went to Calcutta in the 1939. It was the first time that he went in order to enroll in art school at the age of 20. And so we actually spent a lot of time in this exhibition, we won't so much in this talk, sort of thinking about those early years in Calcutta, which were an incredible wellspring of the intelligentsia around the independence era in India. So Lain Singh Bangdel was an incredibly connected figure. He studied with some very well-known modernists that we don't have time to talk about, such as Zainal Abidin, noted Bangladeshi modernist. One of his best friends when he was actually living in Calcutta was the Indian filmmaker Satyajit Ray, which we will get a chance to talk about later today. So we really start with this arc and then follow Lain Singh Bangdel as he actually moves to Europe in the 1950s. And so in 1952, he actually gets on a boat and spends 36 days at sea. These are not luxury accommodations either. And he actually created great travel logs from this time. But he arrived in London and spent about 6 months there. It's actually where he met his future wife, Manu. She was a nurse. And while Lain was sort of living off of stipends, she was the one that actually worked, that was able to kind of, allow him to pursue his art. But here we have two examples of Lain's work from the 50s, which I kind of think really actually encapsulates a lot of his interests during this time period. So you see, the work on the left, which is Muna Madan from the 1950s, and on the right we have Full Moon Night from 1952. So on the left, Muna Madan, it's a quintessentially Nepali subject. It actually refers to an epic love poem that some of you here definitely are familiar with, that was written in the 1930s by a poet named Lakshmi Prasad Devkota. And it's sort of, the way I kind of explaining it, it's a bit like a Romeo and Juliet story of these doomed lovers. That here we're seeing the departing scene actually as Madan, who's the husband on the left, saying goodbye to his wife Muna, and he goes to Tibet in search of work, actually. And this poem, it's supposedly is from dates back to an oral history from the 18th century, or a story from the 18th century. So in those days, it's quite a distance one had to travel as opposed to Qatar or the UAE in search of work. So this is a theme that actually Lain Singh Bangdel would have really identified with as an artist living abroad, of course. And also during this time, he's a writer, actually, which is what he's better known for in Nepal, at least until after he returned, because of course it makes sense. Writing is infinitely more reproducible. It's easier to distribute. So that's sort of what he was known for. So basically, the way that Muna Madan, just to kind of finish this work, the way it actually ends, the story is quite sadly, Madan is enchanted by Tibet, forgets to go home, apparently. Ends up spending 7 months in Tibet, and then sort of wakes up from this daze and realizes that, oh, I need to go back. Unfortunately, during that time, his mother and his wife die of heartache and loss. And, yeah, and then so it gets more tragic too. So Madan, when he returns and realizes that his family has passed away, sadly he follows them too. So this kind of really gripping story. But anyway, on the right, the reason why I show this work is just to emphasize that while Lain Singh Bangdel is living in Europe in the 1950s, he considers himself ethnically Nepali, linguistically Nepali, culturally Nepali. So, and he's participating in that construction of a common Nepali identity, even from Europe, which is just something to kind of just to note. The work on the right, Full Moon Night, it's actually one of the first works that we have from Lain Singh Bangdel, specifically in Paris, that he created in Paris. So this is Lain Singh Bangdel engaging with the city as a theater of the modern world. We can see this is a very, we're not exactly sure where this is. It could be Montmartre in Paris, it could be Mont Saint-Michel, it could be the French village in the French countryside, but it's quintessentially French architecture. And it's really the city becomes a site of formal experimentation that we'll kind of see that thread kind of go through in the work too. But basically, key themes for Lain Singh Bangdel: abstraction, the idea of constructing a Nepali identity, and the city. These are sort of the themes that he deals with first part of his life. So I kind of also just want to briefly touch base about when Lain Singh Bangdel returned in 1961 to Nepal. Nepal had basically finished really a decade of massive political and social transition. This image, which is dated to approximately the 1950s, you can see Nepali workers laying telephone line. Nepal essentially was under the rule of the Rana dynasty until 1951. It ended essentially then when the Shah monarchy was reestablished, a century of isolation from the outside world. And so during that time period, and especially that decade after, there was really intense modernization, including actually the first democratic elections in Nepal, which took place. And then BP Koirala was the first democratically elected prime minister, who was also happened to be one of Lain Singh Bangdel's best friends. And so during this time period, there's massive modernization from the establishment of the first graduate program at Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu, to the expansion of infrastructure such as telephone lines, running tap lines, et cetera, et cetera. So really, really kind of interesting time in the history of Nepal. So in addition to that, then, actually Lain Singh Bangdel, he decides to return to Nepal. BP Koirala, for instance, had actually been really goading him to come back and sort of establish a modern artistic movement. That's quite literally some of his words. He wanted Lain Singh Bangdel to organize Nepal's aesthetic movement. Was actually written to him in a letter. So one of the reasons why he finally comes is because he actually met King Mahendra, because Nepal was at that exact moment, 1960, was a constitutional monarchy. He basically was invited Lain Singh Bangdel to return to Nepal formally. He said, "We'll take care of you, just come on back, you're talented, we want you." And Lain Singh Bangdel did. And so 1961 he returns, but actually after about 18 months of democracy, Nepal, King Mahendra deposed BP Koirala, had him imprisoned. Lain Singh Bangdel arrives in 1961, total outsider to Nepal, total outsider. So, he was not only not even born in Nepal, but he was from an ethnically Rai family, which is not the dominant ethnic majority in Kathmandu. So he was an outsider in many senses of the word. But actually this painting, that I kind of want to emphasize on the left, Moon Over Kathmandu, which we organized the exhibition around, that you can see here, really synthesizes all of Lain Singh Bangdel's hopes at that moment for this country, returning to it. It really depicts Kathmandu harmoniously nestled within the Himalayas, or within the Kathmandu Valley. And there's sort of an idea of this kind of optimism for a country that's exiting this period of political transition. I noticed that I always like to point out there's two things. One, there's actually this kind of really small, let me see if I can get my cursor over there. But if you notice to the middle left, there's almost like a scene within a scene, a small outline of two mountain peaks with a moon. And I actually like to sort of point out that form actually really evokes the Nepali flag, which is actually one of the only non-rectangular flags in the world. It's a double pennant. So there's this kind of quiet patriotism that's almost encoded in the painting. And it's also not titled Sun Over Kathmandu, it's titled Moon Over Kathmandu. And so I think that he's specifically wanting to envision a sense of tranquility for this country that's modernizing itself. So that's kind of my long introduction to Lain Singh Bangdel and the context, the historical context in which he operated in as an artist, at least until his arrival in the 1960s. This later abstract, which kind of becomes his signature style, which is quite fantastic, that you can see here. It takes a lot of cues from Nepal's, of course, very rich geographical heritage in the Himalayas. So that being said, I, of course, also want to be able to turn things over to Priyankar here. And I was actually thinking about, since this was going to be a concise introduction, but I think we should also just bring you into the conversation at this point, because you know this material better than just about anyone. But one of the things that you should know about Shashi Bikram Shah is he was actually one of the founders of the first artist collective in Nepal. First modernist, modern or contemporary. I think that's where Lain Singh Bangdel, modernist for sure. But then when you kind of get to this, the second generation, it's only 20 years younger, that's where it gets kind of actually really blurry, I think. And so I guess my first question for you, Priyankar, is do you see Shashi Shah as, how does he see himself? Does he see himself as participating in, as a modern artist, or does he see himself as someone that's maybe was at one point, but he's definitely now a contemporary artist?
I think, related to what was mentioned earlier, it's even with Lain Singh Bangdel, I would argue that certain aspects of what is modern and contemporary also get blurry, because one of his most significant works has to do with traditional Nepali art, which is the documentation and cataloging of the stolen images.
Of course.
And that's the other reason why he's known as an art historian, is his works with traditional Nepali art, rather than all of the beautiful works we've seen here. And I think with a lot of the artists that you see post-1950s in Nepal, you do have this whole school of individuals who come from India, including my grandfather, so Shashi Bikram Shah, and all of his friends. So Krishna Manandar and Gopal Vaidya. They were at the Sir J.J. School of Arts in India.
Yep.
And what's wonderful, having this conversation here, is that we've been having these series of conversations with the Asia Art Archive in Delhi, and we've gone to their offices and they've sort of opened their doors, and we have a series of these conversations in Kathmandu as well as in Delhi about how there are these interconnections in basically post-colonial Asia that we're not necessarily talking about when we talk about how modern and contemporary art was unfolding post-1950s. And I think with this whole group here, they would now in Nepal sort of be placed in the modernist bracket, similar to other artists in India who were coming at that time, those who were educated in JJ School of Art, the Baroda School, and then also Banaras Hindu University, as well as Shanti Niketan in Calcutta. So you have these regional art schools that are truly producing your new generation of artists, and the same artists who are, the same schools that were training artists in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India were the same schools that were also training these cohort of artists in Nepal. So it just so happens that the four individuals in this particular art collective, SKIB, so that's an acronym of each of their names, so Shashi, Krishna, Indra, and Vatsa. They happen to go to the Sir J.J. School of Arts, and once they were back in Nepal, so my grandfather was the first one in the late 60s, and everyone else by 1971. The collective was sort of established in 1971. And what's been really nice is to have a conversations with a series of artists as well as folks from around the 60s and 70s who were helping establish this new gallery scene in Kathmandu, and to also see this almost invisible imprint of Lain Singh Bangdel throughout most of these individuals' careers. Because you see his works that have been published, you see his artworks, but it's very hard to sort of surmise his influence and the footprint he left behind for quite a lot of artists who really appreciated his mentorship as well as his guidance as one of the senior-most artists who was present in Kathmandu in the late 60s and 70s.
Because it's really, we'll get back to Lain Singh Bangdel's overall shaping of the Nepali art scene, because it goes beyond specifically just art. It really focuses larger, even to institutions, quite really. But I think one of the noticeable things is actually getting a chance to look at this early drawing by Shashi Shah, which we can see. This is actually Vishnu sleeping on the cosmic ocean. You have Lakshmi at his feet, and then Brahma on the lotus. But I'm kind of curious if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what exactly. One, we talked a little bit about how actually there's Shashi Shah had this sort of history actually drawing comics, and also as a drawer, because I think there's something, this work could have been very much at home in the Surrealism exhibition that was just at the Met, maybe some of you saw. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what specifically we're kind of seeing here in terms of where is Shashi Shah in 1978 as an artist?
If you look at most of his works from the 60s to 70s, they're mostly drawing on from surrealist as well as impressionist works, particularly his paintings. Here you see something that's more surrealist and incorporating themes from Hinduism. So there's Vishnu lying on Sheshanag with Lakshmi and Brahma. So he was definitely experimenting with a lot of these religious motifs. And you see similar things happening in India at the same time too, with a lot of these imageries. My grandfather would want me to talk about this in New York because he says this one was collected by Yoko Ono when she was visiting Nepal in the 80s. And she sent him a letter that unfortunately got destroyed in a fire. So if anyone knows her, he would really appreciate appreciate another letter. Every time I leave for New York, he tells me, you need to get me my letter from Yoko Ono again. So, so this piece is probably in New York somewhere, is what he thinks. But
and then I think this is also also a great work to talk about because that kind of shows one, Shashi Shah wasn't simply working with religious iconography. That's that's something just to certainly understand about him. But here, this collage that we see here, it came from, it happened basically immediately after the massacre at Narayani Royal Palace, where basically the crown prince, Dipendra, very tragically assassinated his family, including the king. So I'm kind of curious about, what did this work mean to your father, and sort of or grandfather, and why do you think he made it immediately in the aftermath of this event?
Like you said, with this piece in particular, the Royal Massacre series from 2001, what's rather unique is most of the artists his generation are not necessarily experimenting with like the medium they paint on. Usually it's canvas, and it stayed canvas for quite some time, but this is one of the first times. He was working as a cartoonist for newspapers for a very long time, and he still continues to publish cartoons in Nepal, and very few people actually know about it because it circulates in very small magazines. But over here, he painted on newspaper prints themselves, and these are obituaries that were published for the royal family by either individuals or companies in Nepal. This is just wrapped up. It was exhibited in the Kathmandu Triennale that just closed yesterday. And if anyone's going to be in Berlin, a part of the Kathmandu Triennale is going to Savvy Contemporary, so this will be exhibited in Berlin in the coming few months. What he was sort of dealing with in this piece is that once the monarchs were dead, you sort of had this mourning period in Nepal, and there was also a curfew, so people weren't allowed to leave. And with my grandfather in particular, his part of the family has worked with the monarchs for around 4 generations or even longer. So there was a long line of history that he was actually trying to unravel. And I think it's slightly more nuanced and complicated. We were just talking about it with other artists in Nepal, where one of the art reviewers in Kathmandu sort of said this was sort of the last glorification of the monarchy, but that is certainly not what he's trying to present. It's more of a complicated reading in terms of how the monarchs themselves are perceived as being gods in Nepal, but simultaneously they're very fragile entities. And he's drawing on, metaphors and images from texts that date back even thousands of years to try to encapsulate both how monarchs would have been perceived both within art history, historically in the Hindu tradition, as well as like in the modern time in Nepal. So trying to draw upon all of those figures. And over here you sort of see the lineage of contemporary monarchs in Nepal. So over there's King Tribhuvan, who was the first monarch post-1950s. Then you have King Mahendra, the king who brought Lain Singh Bangdel to Nepal. Then you have King Virendra, the one who died. And then King Gyanendra, the last monarch of Nepal. Alongside this artistic rendition of Prithvi Narayan Shah that's pretty popular in Nepal.
I've seen that one. Yeah. And then, so this actually is a great example of sort of the beginning of specifically Shashi Bikram Shah's, just his style of painting specifically. And there's this really great tension, I think, between abstraction and representation that incorporates that religious iconography that we talked about here. Specifically, this is the 10 incarnations of Vishnu. Vishnu becomes a pretty important subject for Shah over the years. So I'm kind of curious about what this stylistically, sort of how he kind of really crystallized his distinct hand in painting, and sort of what that meant to him, and how that was such a departure from what was coming before that.
Yeah, with this painting in particular, I think, because he was also working for magazines and newspaper publications, and he loves collecting a lot of images from popular media. And if I go through the archives at home, it takes a lot of time to see how he was pulling through various media references. And this one in particular does have a lot of influences from comic books, and particularly at this time is also when India is experimenting a lot with how to portray mythology and Hindu narratives in contemporary light. So I think his paintings do fall into that trajectory, and the themes here actually, they also are mimicked in the previous works we saw with the Royal Massacre series as well. And in particular, the last avatar here, Kalki, that sort of becomes the signature of my grandfather's pieces, which deals more with like post-apocalyptic scenarios and concerns itself more with suffering and the politics of the world as it is.
Yeah.
And the sister, with that painting, there's a version of this in New York actually, in the residence of the UN ambassador to Nepal, I believe.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I think
so. It should be there. So
where apparently there are also 4 other Lain Singh Bangdels that we found because of the show. The ambassador came to the opening and said like, oh yeah, I've got a few of those.
Which is really funny because like one of the other things in Nepal is that we don't have an institution, and I think that's quite important to point out here, is that we don't have an institutional body that sort of oversees any of this. There is the Nepal Academy of Fine Arts, but they don't have anything systematic or put together that archives or contextualizes any of Nepal's recent art history. So it's pretty much left to individuals to sort of figure out. So usually I find that I have this picture, then someone who knows someone will text me a picture on WhatsApp saying like, oh, this painting is in New York. So it's a lot of like informal connections and informal conversations that are going on to contextualize and even put together a lot of the history that we're presenting today.
Yeah. And so this, sort of briefly before we get into our archival material, I mean, this is I'm just in love with this painting, Samudra Manthan from 2018. And this is also a great painting just because it'll emphasize sort of the intergenerational family connections, I think, actually between Bangdel family and the Shahs. But basically what you're seeing here, it's an incredible evocation from Hindu mythology, where basically you have the Asuras on the left, they're a group of deities and demigods, and then the Devas on the right. There's actually a secret self-portrait that Priyankar actually just pointed out to me, which is sort of in one of these figures in the left. But basically there's a story in Hindu mythology of basically these two groups of deities are usually they're battling, but in this case they're working together to produce the elixir of immortality, which is actually, you can see that gold object there at the top of the center. But it's an incredible painting because it was actually shown in this, probably the most significant exhibition of contemporary Nepali art outside of Nepal, which was at the Weltmuseum in Vienna. It was in 2019, actually, and this painting was shown.
With Lain Singh Bangdel.
Yeah, with Lain Singh Bangdels. But also that exhibition was organized by Dina Bangdel, who was Lain Singh Bangdel's daughter. So that was one of her last projects. She worked with 2 other curators on the show, but that was sort of one of her last big projects before she passed away. So it's kind of this amazing, I think, has that amazing meaning too. Yeah. So when we get into the archival material,
Just a question,
of course.
painting and the other one, what was the size of the painting?
Oh yeah.
This one is.
And this is all oil medium?
This is acrylic on canvas. It's about like, it stops like here and it's as long as that is. So it's actually quite representative of the size. My grandmother gets into a lot of arguments with my grandfather because like he didn't paint himself on the side of the gods, which is that side. He painted himself as a demon. And what's interesting is that he's been painting this particular theme since the 1970s. And one of his earliest renditions was actually comparing it to the Cold War with like the US government and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And sort of this theme has been going on
So who was the demon and who was the
it's
god?
rather unclear. I think it's left to the viewer to decide. But that work, surprisingly, has never been exhibited in America, but it's been exhibited in Moscow.
So we know what they think.
Thank you.
But yeah, so this is, and it takes a long time to
Yeah.
put something like this together now. Like,
Yeah.
he works very slowly, so something like this takes nearly 2 years to put together, and it takes layers and layers of works.
It's amazing.
And what was the kind of studio that he had that he would work in?
Oh, it's basically the corridor of our house, and he refuses to use an easel. He hates them. It's usually a chair, so the canvas is propped on a chair, and he'll sit on the floor and paint. That's his style.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is amazing. This belongs in a museum, but it's in your family's
It's in
home
your
currently.
home?
Yeah, it's in our house right now.
Yeah.
It's secured.
Yeah, it's
In bubble wrap since
It's fine.
Vienna.
So this is actually, we'll get sort of into some of the archival material. This is a pretty, I think, pretty indicative of sort of the relationship between Lain Singh Bangdel and SKIB 71. Lain Singh Bangdel basically wrote all of the introductions to SKIB 71's exhibitions. And sometimes they're, like this, they're sort of more formal and just cursory introductions. But oftentimes they would actually be full-on essays where we're sort of talking about SKIB's relationship with the contemporary art of Nepal of today. And so this, I mean, basically they knew each other incredibly well. And they were very, very, very close.
And I think particularly within the collective, there was one artist in particular, Indra Pradhan, who was also from Eastern Nepal and happened to live in Darjeeling, had a very close relationship with Lain Singh Bangdel. And he sort of also had a literary flair similar to Lain Singh Bangdel. So he used to have these conversations with Lain Singh Bangdel about, can you write us these little excerpts for our exhibition catalog, or to write these essays sort of contextualizing what has happened with art in Nepal. And I think that really highlights why such archival work is important, because very few publications survive. And if you look at catalogs from the 70s or 80s, that's sort of where whoever would be considered to be an art critic or an art historian was sort of putting to words what they were seeing and what they thought was happening in the Nepali, the then Nepali contemporary art scene. And Lain Singh Bangdel was definitely one of the most prominent writers, both in terms of traditional art history as well as what was happening with modern art history in Nepal. And if you go back, what's interesting again in that particular document is the person who's written the text in Nepali, Balkrishna Sama, is actually a playwright. So what you see in like 1960s, 70s Nepal is a close relationship between people who are working in literature, so theater as well as fiction, music, so even singers who are coming from Darjeeling, and other musicians like Narayan Gopal, who's very popular in Nepal, and then your painters and your artists. And there was this very close connection between all of these forms of art, which unfortunately, I think in Nepal now it's coming back to a full circle where there's more references as well as more intersectionality in the art forms. But back then, once you start looking at the archives, these relationships become more apparent. But if you're just looking at a painting, you don't really notice how these folks were interconnected to each other. And a lot of people in Nepal also don't know that. And literature, music, and art are sort of being studied separately.
But they're incredibly connected, which is, I think, really important. I think this is also a great image, and is also really quite curious to me, because this is from the inside, selected from one of SKIB's first catalogs, actually back in 1971. But it's actually quite laudatory of Queen Ratna. And so I'm kind of curious the relationship between the collective and the monarchy, and then also what was it like working as an artist in the 1970s in this context?
So particularly with SKIB, all of they were an art collective that lasted from 1971 to like the late 90s. And it sort of fizzles off. There wasn't a clear end date. So they were at least together exhibiting for nearly 20 years. And each exhibition was on the birthday of a queen. So it was either Queen Ratna, who was she's still alive, actually. And but this was the year before King Mahendra died. So that was the only year she inaugurated the exhibition. And what's quite important to say here is that the monarchy in Nepal was quite instrumental in both introducing new visual art forms as well as patronizing it. So, but at the same time, there was a certain level of like, you couldn't paint anything you wanted. And there was and Nepal was under heavy censorship throughout these periods. But interestingly enough, if you start looking at like the paintings that were exhibited clearly in galleries and in proper exhibitions, they're toned down. You might have like abstract expressionist work or things referencing Hindu mythology. But if you go to your underground zines and things that are circulating in a limited audience, then you start seeing more political cartoons or like, and by the same artists actually. So it's quite interesting. So artists themselves are trying to find spaces to sort of express themselves, and we're very well aware of the censorship they were under while working there.
So I think actually this is a great opportunity for Beeb to join us. Who's been Welcome. Please join us.
Thank you.
So one of the, I think, amazing things that I've kind of hinted at and talked about, and Beeb, we're going to throw it right to you, so I hope you're ready. Is how basically how connected Lain Singh Bangdel was as an individual to not only the Nepali elite, but specifically all sorts of different luminaries within the larger South Asian region, in particular Satyajit Ray. So we're going to go back into like history a little bit. And Beeb, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about, what was their relationship? How did they meet?
Oh, okay, yeah. When Lain went to study his college, art college in Calcutta, so he was, Calcutta at that point in time was actually a hub, intellectual hub in whole India. They had just started this independent movement, so there are a lot of, poet, writer, movie maker, all they were actually, Calcutta was the main hub. So, he got introduced to many people over there, artists, right? And Satyajit Ray and he worked together in a farm while he was working as a student. And they share the same desk in a DJ Kimmer workshop. That they were very good.
Advertising firm.
Advertising firm, yeah. So they were very good for him. And then later I think he came back to Nepal in 1986, right? So to make a movie, and then they reconnected again. But during the whole time, I think they communicated, with letters and all those things. So he was a very good friend.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of jump in on that, one of the things that a really interesting parallel between the two, since they knew each other throughout the 1940s, Satyajit Ray's most significant film was the Apu trilogy, at least his first, major kind of international splash, which details for those of you that haven't seen it, the hardships of life in rural Bengal. That was in the 1950s. I think actually it sort of dovetails with Lain Singh Bangdel making paintings that actually are dealing with this period of the Bengal famine. So it's this really delayed response to an incredibly tragic event, and they actually both share a similar timeline in terms of processing that, which I wanted to point out. But this actually is, now we're sort of more back to Priyankar, talking about your work archiving the legacy of SKIB, the legacy of Shashi Bikram Shah. And so this actually, if you want to tell us a little bit about this slide and sort of the work that you've been doing and the different exhibition catalogs.
Like us in Nepal trying to put together a trajectory of how exhibitions sort of were being structured in Nepal from the 70s up until now. And what I was telling Owen too is, often when we talk about archival research in Nepal, it's usually stuff pre-19th century. A lot of folks are working with even early modern period materials in particular. However, a lot of things from the 20th century are also in a rather fragile state. And there's practically no institutional framework to even study or support the archiving of such works. If you press next. So basically, we don't know where most of these documents are. We actually have only a third of the documents related with SKIB exhibitions. And at least in this particular case, what is really interesting is that because they were a collective, and maybe that's one of the nice things when you work in a collective is if you lose something, your friend has the other thing. So this material was drawn on from 4 different people's houses. We did find 2 or 3 other documents. I haven't been able to update this slide, but one of the usefulness of working in a collective is that you sort of share this material and they existed in different spaces, and it also helps look at this whole span of time, which is quite difficult in Nepal to find documents of. Mm-hmm. And I think it's quite sad, but also important at the same time to understand that there's quite a lot of recent history that does need to be salvaged to a certain degree. I mean, given continuous floodings as well as earthquakes, there's so many documents that have been lost in Kathmandu. And it's important to note that just because it's the past 50 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe or
it's there.
Or we'll find it in the next 5 years.
Yeah. So this is an incredible photo, and actually, it just really takes us back to a different time period. And I think I mentioned that Lain Singh Bangdel was, of course, quite good friends with B.P. Koirala, the first Prime Minister of Nepal. So, B, do you want to tell us a little bit about this photo?
Yeah, this is, I think, when the Prime Minister visited, he was back in London actually. He was on the tour to US. When he returned back to Nepal, he went via London. And so at that point in time, when Bibhakar Shakya said, I don't want to meet any other Nepalis, I will come for breakfast at your home. So that's outside their home. So they had breakfast together. And Bibhakar always wanted Lain to go back to Nepal too, because he was such an artist and modern artist. So he wanted him to come to Nepal and contribute in art and culture and this stuff. So he was always pushing him. But Lain was not too sure, I don't know what in Nepal, what do I do over there? I've never been in that country, how do I survive? And so those are the initial discussions, but he was always pushing, come here. So then we can, I think there's another slide of then.
No, dive into this since we just
So
had this one.
later, I think when King actually visited London again after a few years, I think in 60, he was King Mahendra and Bibhakar again visited London, and then Lain and Manu were planning to move to US actually. Manu already got job here in Johns Hopkins, and they were planning to move here. And on that evening, then King, because B.B. Koirala introduced Lain to King, and then King said, okay, and I heard a lot about you from our Prime Minister, so you should come to Nepal. And then Lain said no to King. And then his question to King was, how do I survive? So, I don't know anybody. And King said, okay, I'll take care of it, okay? With that word, he canceled all his trip and moved to US. Then he moved to Nepal in 1961. So that's an rest, you all know. Then he settled down, he started working there. As they say, rest is history, because he put all his life in Nepal. So.
Yeah, I think there's this really amazing ability of Lain Singh Bangdel, specifically to be, he was able to maintain friendships with both kings and, in the case of B.P. Koirala, revolutionaries. Because B.P. Koirala didn't just emerge onto the political scene without at least some level of agitation, on his part, organizing strikes at jute mills and things like that. But B.P. Koirala was also a writer, too, which is kind of why he so emphasized and appreciated Lain Singh Bangdel's contributions and cultural contributions. So I'm going to skip this one. I think this is a great photo, Priyankar, of Batsa Gopal. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship with this photo and with SKIB today.
This is in the process of sort of talking with my grandfather's friend. So what's nice is that each artist sort of brought their own skill set. So Batsa Gopal did the artist pictured here and here. He used to work actually in the division of the Nepali government that designed the currency. So he was a graphic designer as well for the government. And this picture was taken in one of Nepal's first studio photography studios. And this is sort of the image that got cut up into your Beatle-esque fashion, SKIB catalog that he designed. So he was very happy when he found this image and recounting fond stories of how they as a group, because it's basically a bunch of friends from school who got together and we're trying to figure out, well, what do we do with our education? How do we sort of present our artworks? And this is all when they were just in their mid-20s, and when we're talking to Nepali art students, it's sort of that's the same age that they are right now.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to see that there's quite a... the other funny story with regards to this is that, talking about the fragility of archives, there are a series of Nepali artists who've been working in the 90s and 20s who've lost a bunch of their works because it was saved on hard drives. And either the hard drives got lost or things got destroyed, so particularly with artists working in digital formats. But with a lot of the artists working in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they have a massive paper trail. So you can go, you can talk to them, it's basically, this is probably the next picture.
Yeah.
But images like this, so you just sit and that's Krishna Manandar over there sort of, and he does these larger abstract pieces. So you can talk to them, and this is Indra Pradhan's archives over here that were a bit chaotic. That's one of my regrets, is I sort of went and organized all of my grandfather's mess without actually taking a picture of what it looked like earlier. And the other thing related to this is that when you encounter someone's archive, something that I found very interesting is it gives you a perspective into them as an individual and what they were thinking in terms of what these materials meant to them. And that's particularly reflected very well when you look at how Lain Singh Bangdel, in particular, structured his own archives and his own works.
Yeah. Which we'll get a chance to look at. So I also want to emphasize that Lain Bangdel was, of course, a writer. And this is kind of amazing because it's actually a poem that he had written in English. He actually preferred to write in Nepali with his literature. So I'm kind of curious if you wanted to tell us a little bit about this poem. It's a quite fabulous object.
Yeah, this is actually they were 1 year after marriage, and Manu was working in London and Lain was still in Paris. So they were long distance relationship, and so. And at that point, he wrote a lot of interesting stories, and so basically in expressing his love. And the way he will address, write a lot of letters to his wife, who is living in and I think also I need to underscore over here. I think Manu was the one who was supporting him when he was working, and he was a struggling student in Paris. So every 2 weeks he will put like 5 or 10 pounds in regular envelope and send it. In those days, postal service was so, you don't need to do anything certified or registered. Just put like 2 pennies stamp and it will go, and Malayan will receive money. And then he will, in return, he will write all these beautiful love letters. Appreciate it. And he's addressing like my moon sun, my sunflower, my moon, all these beautiful. But we have actually diary published in Nepal, so we're in the process of translating that in English. So we have a collection of his letters. And so this is one of those moments where he is really missing her, and so this is
this is also an amazing photo too, which is Lain Singh Bangdel outside his home in Sanipal, which is near Kathmandu. I've been fortunate enough to have been to this house a few times, and it's incredible. And I was wondering, this is in the 1960s, this photo. So, Biba, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the significance of the house, which of course is still there.
This house actually Lain designed and construct from the ground up. Actually, he was artist. He drew everything, like the map and everything. And even the brick, each brick in the house was clean in the backyard of the house, and it had the initials of his name, LSB, Lain Singh Bangdel. So each brick in the building had his initials. There's a lot of history in this house, and he did most of his painting, his studio, his art, everything was done. So in article we see after he returned from Paris, to London, from Europe to Nepal in early 60s. So he has paintings, a few paintings that he did in Calcutta in early 40s. Then most of his painting he did in London and Paris in early 50s. Then the rest of his all painting was actually done in this house. So it's quite a significant historical resource.
Yeah, and I think also that the fact that there's just even like interior, like the different living spaces, there's like a living room, right? There's there's like a dining room.
And it's like totally that. I think he tried to bring the European style of living. That since he was in London and Paris for so many years, so he put this house inside. Once you go, it doesn't feel like you were in Nepal at that point in time in early 60s. So it was quite a modern building in early 60s that time in Kathmandu Valley.
Yeah, it's great. So this is also another great photo. So just to give you an idea, especially in his older years, just how esteemed Lain Singh Bangdel was, within Nepal. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, this was Queen's state visit to our country, but during the same year, actually, Lain also visited London, and he was knighted by the Queen in 1986 in London. So this is the Queen's visit to state visit to Nepal, and we have King Virendra on the right hand side, and so this is
just kind of an absolutely incredible archival photo. So Priyankar, maybe this will be like one of the kind of the last slides before we wrap things.
What was wonderful, particularly while talking with members of the SKIB Collective as well, and particularly the family of Indra Pradhan. Indra Pradhan passed away in 1997, and after he died, Lain Singh Bangdel was really close to him, actually approached the family and put together an exhibition, a posthumous retrospective of Indra Pradhan at the Nepal Art Council, which is an institution he helped establish.
Right.
So he plays many roles. It's not just as an artist, it's also as a curator, as a mentor, as a historian, as a writer.
Right.
And I think it's him as a historical figure sort of needs to be understood in all of his complexities. His abstract artworks are just a fraction, actually, of his contributions to Nepali society.
Yeah. So I think this actually might be a good moment we can open it up for questions. So we still have We're still on time.
So before I start open the question, we have Vishnu Gautamji. Yeah, so let me welcome Vishnu Gautamji to this thing. He is our deputy councillor in New York government of Nepal.
Right.
Do you want to speak few words? You said you want to do some comment about it, talk about art and culture. Lain Singh Bangdel, Shashi Bikram Shah. Why don't you say some few words? What do you think about this talk and how you?
First of all, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
First of all, let me greet all of you. Namaste. I'm Vishnu Gautam. I'm an acting consul general of Nepal in New York. I was really invited to talk to this program, but unfortunately I declined that invitation because I was not knowledgeable much on those luminary figures. Therefore, I just said that I'll be present there with a view to recognize their contribution, appreciate their art and their works and their writings, and at the same time to pay them respect and basically to learn from these gentlemen who are already knowledgeable enough on those luminary figures, and to help myself learn more about these our great figures who have contributed. I would like to thank Bibhakar, Priyankar and Dr. Duffy for having me here today. I know Lain Singh Bangdel, but much of the things that I have known about them has truly been aided a lot because speaking later on after hearing from others, it will be very easier. As truly said Lain Singh Bangdel as an art historian, the government of Nepal basically recognizes him as an art historian. He's also a writer and artist. But his major contribution is in the protection and preservation of sculptures, our lost heritage. And with the help of him, with the help of his writings, the government has recovered many of those stolen and lost pieces. Many of them have returned back to the country. Myself, coming to one here in New York, I myself have worked many times looking at those books from where I can decipher some evidences, from where the origins, all that things, which some of our government institutions unfortunately do not have. The earthquake 2015 to some extent also destroyed some of our archives, but at the same time we also didn't have very good record. That is how Lain Singh Bangdel has been filling that great vacuum. Therefore, we truly appreciate his contribution. And about Shashi Bikram Shah, I really appreciate his art, especially. I was very amazed to see some of the art. I saw that the perspective that he puts on his cosmological point of view, basically in the mythical, on Puranas, all that things. But at the same time, as a modern artist, as a modern painter, he has been a pioneer figure, a leading figure, and both of them great inspiration for our people, for our contemporary generation and the future generation, because after all, art is very powerful. Some people say that art for art's sake, there is nothing meaning or any objective that the artist looks for, but I think artist puts a lot of efforts, a lot of thoughts when that artist creates something, and that must have its meaning. He tells about the society, he tells about his family, he tells about his life, he tells about the greater country, and not only country here, we are talking about philosophy, mythology, the Puranas, all that things, how they narrate to the contemporary generation, contemporary time, and the future as well. In that sense, we have a lot of things to learn from, to be inspired from, and we need to continue to inspire get inspired and appreciate that. Not only that, they have also connected our different societies together. For me, these artists have, as we talked here about France, as we talked about London, as we were talking about USA, these artists have connected us, connected the countries, connected the people. So there are very closer linkages, and ultimately they are connecting hearts. All these people REC are basically because what they have contributed, what they have seen, they are all some kind of curiosities there. And these hearts, I myself cannot generate. The arts have. Therefore, I pay my deep regards and respect to them. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you very much. I have one guest coming all the way from Nepal to come to this exhibition, musical occasion. He's Bibhakar Shakya. He's our leading, musician of our in Nepali movie industry, or Nepali government. You want to say a few words?
He's the judge of the Nepal Idol, and he's the best composer of Nepal.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you, Consul General, for those incredibly eloquent words. And we're always just honored that guests have come from so far to join us this afternoon.
And we have two guests from Dallas and October.
But I'm curious if anyone has any questions that they want to pose to our speakers.
I have a question concerning the two artists. Were they coming from family of artists? Because one was born in a farm somewhere in India somewhere,
yes.
And the other one family was, you say, was linked with the royalty for many generations, but not artists.
Not in art.
So what
It was mostly in administration in various departments. My grandfather had 7 older brothers, so they sort of went into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Home Ministry, and his parents said, "You're the one who can do whatever you want." And so he ended up with art.
This artistic, this creativity was their own. I mean, there was no family tradition behind it.
In case of Lain Singh Bangdel, he was a farm boy. He lived in a really village far from Darjeeling city, 7-8 miles. He never seen city or lights and anything. So when he was until his teenage years, he didn't even have a CPR. He went to local village school. But I think he talks about that because he has so much time just roaming around village, the Darjeeling was beautiful hill station. You will see sunrise, you see the majestic Kanchenjunga, Himalayan range, and he was just roaming around, looking at the flowers, roaming around tea estate garden and all everything. So he explains, he talks about one moment that changed his life. That one evening he was just roaming around in the village. Then he saw this sunset on Kanchenjunga, this beautiful golden orange image. That image, he thinks how that image inspired the artist in himself. So he always very much closer to nature. He always was it like even when he was walking. Sometimes I'll just walk with him and the full moon night. I'll be okay. Let's go home. He will not go home. He just watch the full moon and stay there for like 10-15 minutes. Observe everything in a greater detail, I think. So that's, I think, it's just watching, going close to the nature. That's how he became art. That's why he pursued, I think. So in the beginning, when he started painting, he would be just doing like a leaf of one tree or flower. So that's how he started.
Stylistically, what is the connection of these two each to their English education and to the Indian contemporary movement in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Essentially, the first part of answering that is they're both the products of colonial institutions, the Sir J.J. School, which is really one of the most prestigious art schools in India, as well as which was where Shashi Bikram Shah went, and also Lain Singh Bangdel went to the Government School of Art and Craft in Calcutta, also a colonial institution. So they're essentially both products of the British colonial system. And what's quite fascinating is they're some of the first individuals to go abroad, certainly from Nepal, to become specialized in something, like to go receive like an education, become specialized in it, which differentiates them, I think, quite a bit from previous generations. I mean, stylistically, that's actually a more kind of complicated question. But I think for Lain Singh Bangdel, Priyanka, I'll let you talk about Shashi's work, but for Lain Singh Bangdel, his closest relationships, I think, are actually with Indian modernists. So if you know names of like F.N. Souza or S.H. Raza, M.F. Hussain. M.F. Hussain is probably actually a good kind of counterpoint for Shashi Bikram Shah. Akbar Padamsee is actually a great one. There's a lot of these South Asian artists who are kind of trying to pursue this idea of the modern, artistically speaking, around the same time. And Lain Singh Bangdel was actually right there with them. He just hasn't maybe been recognized at least by auction markets and by institutions in the same way that they have been. But for Shashi, how would you answer that?
I mean, stylistically, he also has abstract expressionist works, which are rather rare. But we didn't have pictures here. But he was clearly influenced by Lain Singh Bangdel in that sense. But I agree with you in the sense that I think, particularly historians of recent art history in South Asia, particularly trying to pull together threads of what was happening, both post-partition as well as post-independence of Bangladesh. So trying to see how these figures such as Zainul Abidin, Lain Singh Bangdel, you have folks like the Bombay Progressive Group, and again, artists in Nepal who I think, because in contemporary historiography, Nepal doesn't neatly fit into the post-partition modality of South Asia. In a lot of historical interpretations, not just art, even in other fields, Nepal's sort of this corner country that's left out. But if you actually come and look at the artistic works as well as the archival materials that do exist, there is this interconnection that's happening across the board in South Asia with regards to how modernism, particularly in the post-colonial period, is unraveling.
Yeah.
And like regards to style, there are artists working on like various hosts of different techniques, including abstractions, figurative stuff, modernist interpretations of traditional mythology. That's common across the board.
Yeah, for sure.
And both of them have done the wide genres of painting, starting from still life, landscape, Himalayan, and the portrait also. I mean, so there's wide range of work.
Yeah.
But later, I think in Lain's case, he was doing those things in the beginning because he was so close to nature. But then later he found himself free to express in abstract art, because when you do landscape, portrait, anything, you are given some subject that you are boxed in, But he talks about anything you see, you can see what is realistic out there, and then you can also see through your heart what you can see, feel. So the abstract art for me, feeling from his soul, actually, that's what he talks about.
Yeah. Yes.
So you all have talked about kind of the influence that Darjeeling in particular has had on Mr. Bangdel's work, and also the deliberate thought that he put into moving to Nepal. And I was wondering, he lived during a time where there was a lot of movement with the Naxalites. There was a lot of movement, in particular with seeking statehood in Darjeeling. And I was wondering, one, whether any of that took an influence in his work. And number two, when he moved to Nepal, whether he, despite being someone that moved around in very high circles in Nepal, found any resistance to the fact that he's not actually Nepali national by birth, and how he felt about that.
Great questions. I mean, to answer, I'll answer, you can follow on.
Sure.
Number one, I think he tried to keep himself away from politics as much as possible. So that's why he was not quite, involved in all this national movement in Darjeeling, and also, freedom fighter. Like the prime minister who brought him to Nepal, T.P. Koirala, after he came to Nepal, he was prisoned. And then he still continued to work with King, and still continued to contribute his art and, the thing to the art. But even Bibi was, because he was recommended by Bibi, sometimes what happens, if Bibi is in jail and Lain Singh Bangdel was basically he was the one who brought it. So in a way, Bangdel could have been in a jeopardy, like he could have lost his job, he could have be deported or whatever. But he was such a humble and gentle person. Like he just separated those two beautifully. So he still kept working. So he said, "I am artist. I'll do my work. Not want to be involved in politics in any way." But second question was, that's also very important. Like many local people in Kathmandu, like they were kind of, there are some, there are a few groups like his grandfather, there's so many other amazing artists and literature. They welcome him as Nepali and he can contribute. But there are some groups like, they say, oh, he's not even Nepali, why he's here? He was born in India, then he went up. So his job, local Nepali should get his job. So he's actually getting our job. And so there are some tension and issues like that. But, Lain try to ignore and just focus in his work, contribute what he can do. So that there is some resistance and some tension was there. But he tried to, move away with that and manage it beautifully, I would say. Yeah. You want to add?
I guess just that Darjeeling was such an intellectual hub at the time because there was so much censorship in Nepal, especially in that century leading up to opening up from isolation. So there are major cultural outputs kind of coming from there, including some of the first Nepali language newspapers, I think, earlier in the 20th century, are coming out of Darjeeling. So that's a much larger, the exhibition doesn't focus as much on that. And my research so far hasn't focused on that. There's definitely a lot there. But I saw,
I just wanted to add a small thing in addition to what you just said, relating to your question. Darjeeling, we all perhaps have in background that the territory of Darjeeling was exchanged as a part of the agreement between Nepal and the British India. So a lot of people in Darjeeling, even though they were a part of India, they had a lot of feelings emotionally and many respects towards Nepal. So in that case, in several respects, it was also considered a cultural capital.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of performing arts, in terms of fine arts, and so many things. So I don't think there was such a huge resistance in Nepal just about the fact that he was from there, but there may have been some exceptional issues. And he made it a beautiful point when he said that he remained an artist, he remained a literary figure, he remained very neutral in politics, and that's what led the road to his acceptability within Nepal. And even some of those rulers who did not have tolerance for any other type of opposing politics, they also ended up accepting him into the mainstream of Nepalese society.
He had a lot of challenges coming to Nepal, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's something that's quite particular. And I also want to clarify when he said art and politics don't mix. I think he's really specifically about partisan politics in mid-century Nepal, as opposed to, he definitely was an advocate for social justice, as we would talk about it today. He was committed to giving life to perhaps the interior worlds of those lower caste who come from impoverished backgrounds through his writing and painting, which we don't focus so much on this talk, just to kind of add that to the mix.
But he did, he did make a series of democracy series, freedom and democracy, abstract form. So he did have some, interest in politics and how, especially in the early 90s, we have a democratic movement in Nepal. So he had like 5-6 abstract painting.
When he's much more established,
right?
So as opposed to
in the early 90s,
outsider.
actually. So he started.
But I think that question's also particularly important because before, I guess the 1950s, you didn't need contemporary state identities to travel across most of the Himalayas. You had people going to Tibet, going to India, living multiple lives and having very fluid identities for quite a significant period of history. And it's only post-1950s that you have a concept of a concrete nationality sort of coming up. And Lain Singh Bangdel is an interesting figure because he sort of manages to navigate very complex and rather conservative nationalist identities in Nepal as someone who comes from a minority background and manages to be very, very successful. And and there is resentment in Nepal in certain quarters because of his identity and because of his success. It's not that it's not there, I think this talk would be rather, it's rather short to go through all of those complexities, but it does exist in short. And with regard to Darjeeling, I think that's like a PhD waiting to happen for someone. It's I think like, I mean, I don't know if critical was good, but, and it's not just Lain Singh Bangdel, there's like Aruna Lama, there's Parijat, there's a whole like, an entire cohort of artists.
Oh, I mean, music, literature, I mean, you talk about it. It's every year.
Yeah, and SKIB 71, their first exhibition too, like the first year they formed, they went to Darjeeling to exhibit at one of the schools there. I think it was actually Loreto Convent, but but it was that idea, like Darjeeling was the cultural hub for any Nepali artist in the 70s, and you had to go there as almost as of a pilgrimage. And I think those connections, I mean, they still exist, certain strands of them, but the contextualization of that history has been rather poor.
Yeah. I want to be mindful of time, so maybe we have time for one more question.
I'd like to have a question about the archives.
Of course.
Where are the archives?
Yes.
Under whose auspices are they being gathered? And what are you thinking about plans and the future of these archives?
I mean, they're in varied states. Bibhakar also has a wonderful archive. We've been helping. We have a small team in Nepal that works on. I mean, we can show this one too. This is the archives of actually the stolen images of Nepal book that Lain Singh Bangdel put together. And what I was saying is that, like, Lain Singh Bangdel's archive is like an archivist's dream, because he has all the metadata on the envelope. It's like the title of the work, where it was taken, the date, and the copies. It's like it's magical. And he knew that someone was going to come and do these work, which is unlike my grandfather. He like throws everything. Like there are rats that have gotten into them. And like it's quite. I mean, very different personalities, and you could tell. And the labelings are just excellent.
Yeah, I mean, just to not only he was such a fantastic organizer into the. I mean, even he wrote all those diary, like while traveling to like when he took ship from Calcutta to London, like 36 right on the cargo ship. So every day he would write a diary, and he made it in a way that he knew that someone would publish that in later days. So he had already thinking, he didn't publish any of most of his writing, but he managed put it in a way that when my late wife did that, I said, we have to publish this, this is like so that kind of, foresight here, and look at this labeling, and we have so many other things.
He had very good research, but in addition to where they are, they're all in Kathmandu. My grandfather's archives are in my home. Most of the other artists, they have them as personal archives. We have a small informal, now it's formalized art archiving sort of organization that some of my friends, Bibhakar has also had conversations with us. We're called Kalakula, and we're sort of trying to put together these documents and particularly make them available digitally, because, similar to what Asia Archive does, like wonderful works throughout Hong Kong and India.
We need to talk more.
Yeah, we need to talk more. And we've been in conversation with the Delhi office in particular, and there's Mobile Library, a small Asia Art Archive project happening in Kathmandu right now, and they've been in touch with us trying to scan particularly periodicals from the 70s up until now. So they exist in people's houses, libraries, and
we just started the scratch, I would say, but we started scanning the document, important papers in the process. We found unpublished articles, that poem that you see, we just found through that thing, and we found few unpublished, amazingly important articles.
I forgot to put one of the images, but I did send it to you. But it was while going through, I was looking at some of the photographs we managed to scan, and there was one where it was Lain Singh Bangdel and 3 unidentified men in a park in Kathmandu, but the back he'd scribbled on pencil saying SKIB ko party ma, balazuma, which in English is SKIB used to organize these picnics on the outskirts of Kathmandu, and a lot of the artists used to gather, so these informal art conversations that used to happen. So there's a picture of Lain Singh Bangdel in a picnic that was organized by the art collective SKIB. So there are a lot of these connections you see in the archives that are wonderful, and we are really hoping in Nepal to try to get them to be more accessible, to try to have them survive in digital formats as well, and also have students and researchers actually view them, because these have sort of been outside of the purview of any type of research for nearly 50 years.
And there will be, I think, not only one, I think many PhDs and master's theses, waiting to happen, I guess. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I guess also just one last thing to add is when we were working on the exhibition, whenever like we were wondering, is there like this document there somewhere for the research? And basically, back in Sanipa in Kathmandu, actually younger contemporary artists are the ones that are actually working with Bib on when needing things. So Shilasha Rajmandari and his Hitman Gurung, who are actually the co-curators of the Triennale and are working on the first Nepali pavilion at the Venice Biennial.
Right.
So it's kind of amazing the way that this community is thinking about the future, but also archiving the history too.
There's definitely new energy.
Right.
Yeah.
We hope to sustain.
One
Who
more.
is the woman in the picture?
Oh yeah.
We can ask around and get.
We can find out. We'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. One more comment. Yeah.
It's not a question. What I wanted to say, as passionate and wonderful artists they were, his grandfather and his father-in-law, similarly a very passionate keepers and promoters of their art and the legacies are both these gentlemen who are doing fabulous work, promoting it, bringing it to the world. And I have observed you from the day when the exhibition opened here, so I could not go without saying a word about it. And you carry that legacy in spirit, and thank you so much to all of you. And I think the word of artist and the art owes a lot to your dedication and passion, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Priyankar. Thank you, Vibhakar. Don't worry about it at all. Don't think about it. We're sorry about New York traffic. Anyway, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.